If you fly over the Everglades at sunrise, it still looks eternal. A river of grass stretching through the horizon, silver water channels reflecting pink sky, wading birds lifting off in slow motion like something out of a nature documentary that wants you to believe the world is still intact. From 2,000 feet up, nothing seems broken. That is the illusion. Because on the ground, the Everglades is no longer the ecosystem most people think it is. It's been structurally altered by a predator that was never supposed to be there. A reptile from Southeast Asia that now dictates the rhythm of life in one of America's most iconic wetlands. The Burmese python is not just an invasive species in Florida, it is an ecological regime change. And here's the uncomfortable part. This didn't happen because nature is chaotic. It happened because we are. For decades, Burmese pythons were imported into the US through the exotic pet trade. They were sold cheaply, displayed at reptile expos, marketed as manageable animals for enthusiasts that wanted something dramatic. As hatchlings, they're striking, manageable, even charismatic. But they don't stay that way. They grow into 12 to 18 foot apex predators capable of swallowing deer, outcompeting native carnivores, and reproducing at rates that dwarf most mammals in the Everglades. A popular explanation for how they established themselves in Florida usually centers on Hurricane Andrew in 1992. The story goes that a reptile breeding facility was damaged, snakes escaped, and the Everglades became their new home. That narrative is clean. It implies accident. It also implies that a single catastrophic event created the problem, but reality is messier. Evidence suggests that multiple introductions likely occurred over time through escaped pets, intentional releases, and small-scale breeding operations. The genetic diversity found in the current python population indicates that this was not one isolated escape event. It was a pattern, a slow drip of biological introductions into a subtropical environment perfectly suited for survival. And survival is exactly what they did. Once established, the Burmese python encountered something rare in ecological history. A massive food-rich habitat with virtually no natural predators capable of suppressing adult individuals. Yes, American alligators can sometimes kill pythons, right? Yes, large predators occasionally clash. That's not the same as systemic population control. There's no tiger in Florida. No large constrictor competitor evolved to check their expansion. In ecological terms, the python entered a vacuum at the top of the food web. The consequences were not subtle. Long-term wildlife surveys conducted in the Everglades National Park documented staggering declines in mid-sized populations of mammals over the last 2 decades. Raccoons, possums, and bobcats, once common in night surveys, plummeted in number. In some areas, researchers recorded declines exceeding 99%. Marsh rabbits nearly vanished in regions where pythons became established. The correlation between pythons' presence and mammal collapse is one of the cleanest patterns observed in invasive species science in North America. Statistics, though, can feel abstract, but let's make it concrete. Imagine walking through a forest, right, where nearly every small and mid-sized mammal has disappeared. The rustle in the underbrush is gone. The nocturnal movement is gone. The scavengers are reduced. The entire behavioral texture of the ecosystem changes. It's not just about fewer animals. It's about the removal of ecological roles. Raccoons disperse seeds and regulate certain prey species. Possums consume carrion and insects, influencing disease dynamics. Bobcats control rodent populations and compete with other mesopredators. When you remove these animals at scale, you don't just reduce biodiversity, you rewire trophic interactions. The Everglades is not simply under pressure, it is undergoing structural transformation. Now here's where the debate becomes uncomfortable, right? Because some argue that ecosystems are dynamic and resilient. Fine, but species have moved across continents before. Climate shifts have altered habitats for millennia. Maybe this is just another example of ecological change. Maybe the Everglades will stabilize with pythons as a permanent apex predator. See, there's a difference between gradual evolutionary change and rapid anthropogenic shock. The Burmese python did not arrive slowly over thousands of years. It arrived through global trade networks, pet markets, and regulatory gaps. The speed of the shift compresses adaptation windows. Native species cannot evolve defenses against a 15-foot constrictor in a few decades. And while Florida has declared war on the python, funding removal teams, hosting annual python challenges, and incentivizing contractors to capture snakes, the scale of the Everglades makes eradication improbable. The wetlands span roughly 1.5 million acres of dense, waterlogged terrain. Pythons are cryptic, largely nocturnal, and capable of remaining motionless for long periods. Even trained hunters equipped with thermal imaging struggle to detect them consistently. Thousands have been removed, yet population estimates remain uncertain. When wildlife managers cannot confidently quantify a population, total eradication becomes a fantasy. At best, removal programs may suppress numbers locally, right? But at worst, they create the illusion of control while reproduction continues unchecked elsewhere. And reproduction is where the math becomes brutal. A single female Burmese python can lay 30 to 80 eggs in a clutch, sometimes more than that. Even if a fraction of those survive, that is exponential growth. Compare that to native mammals that produce a handful of offspring annually. Predation pressure combined with slow reproductive rates means recovery becomes biologically difficult. Now layer climate change on top of that. For years, some experts believed occasional cold snaps would limit python expansions northward. But climate models suggest warming trends may expand suitable habitat across more of Florida. A predator that once seemed confirmed to the southern Everglades could potentially push outward as winters become milder. We are in effect fighting an invasive apex predator while simultaneously warming the climate in ways that may benefit it. That is not irony. That's systemic contradiction. There is also an economic dimension that rarely gets discussed in depth. The Everglades is not only an ecological treasure, it is a tourism engine. Wildlife viewing, photography, guided tours, and conservation branding all depend on the perception of a functioning biodiverse wetland. If mammal populations remain suppressed long term, the ecological richness that draws visitors may diminish. You cannot build ecotourism around animals that have largely disappeared. But the deeper issue is philosophical. The python invasion exposes a regulatory pattern we have been repeating for decades. Exotic species become popular in trade. Regulation lags. Demands surge. Ecological damage occurs. Then policy reacts. By the time restrictions tighten, establishment has already occurred. The Burmese python is not an anomaly. It is a case study in systemic delay. Lionfish in the Atlantic, cane toads in Australia, feral hogs across the American South. Each story follows a similar act. Human-mediated introduction followed by ecological consequence, followed by expensive and often incomplete mitigation. And here's the uncomfortable ethical question. Once an invasive species becomes deeply established, what does responsibility look like? I mean, the python didn't choose Florida, it just followed opportunity. We provided that opportunity. So when we wage war on it, killing thousands annually, are we correcting a mistake or perpetuating a cycle of reactive intervention? There is no simple framework for this. Conservation requires difficult decisions, but framing the python purely as a villain obscures the human infrastructure that created the problem. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the Everglades had already crossed an ecological tipping point. Ecosystems do not always revert to prior states after disruption. Remove enough nodes in a food web and feedback loops shift permanently. If mid-sized mammals remain at suppressed levels for decades, recovery potential declines. Genetic bottlenecks occur. Behavioral adaptations entrench. At that stage, the Everglades of 1980 may not be recoverable, not because restoration is poorly funded, but because ecological memory has been erased. And this is where the python invasion stops being a Florida story and becomes something bigger. The Everglades is one of the most studied wetlands on the earth. It receives federal funding, academic attention, and public awareness. If we struggle to control invasive apex predators here, what does that say about less visible ecosystems worldwide? Tropical forests, freshwater systems, island habitats, all are subject to similar pressures from trade, climate, and global movement of species. The Bermuda python is not rewriting the Everglades alone. It is rewriting our assumptions about control. We like to believe ecosystems are robust enough to absorb our mistakes. We like to believe that with enough funding and effort, we can reverse ecological damage. Sometimes that's true, but not always. Some transformations are slow enough that we barely notice until the baseline has shifted permanently. And maybe that's the most dangerous part of it. This was not a sudden disaster. It was incremental, year by year, survey by survey. Fewer raccoons, fewer possums, fewer bobcats, fewer small mammals along nighttime transects. No dramatic collapse, just erosion. Humans are wired to respond to spectacle, not gradual disappearance. The python invasion did not explode. It accumulated. And accumulation is harder to confront. The Everglades will not disappear tomorrow. Water will still move south. Alligators will still bask in the sun. Birds will still migrate through the wetlands. From the air, it'll still look wild. But something fundamental has shifted beneath the surface. An apex predator from another continent now shapes the food web of a protected animal. An apex predator from another continent now shapes the food web of a protected American landscape. This fact alone should force us to reconsider how casually we move species across the globe, how slowly we regulate trade, and how confidently we assume nature can absorb whatever we reintroduce to it, and how confidently we assume nature can absorb whatever we introduce to it. The Burmese python is not just an invasive snake. It is a warning. If a handful of imported pets can restructure a 1 million acre ecosystem in a few decades, what else are we underestimating right now? Thanks for watching. I'm Curtis. See you next time.